So I was talking to a friend on Discord a little bit ago, and they said some bullshit to me, right? They said water was wet, and I'm a skeptical person. I did not take this at face value. I did my research, and by my research I meant I made it up. I made it up, right? So at the whole crux of the argument, you have three words in the question. Is water wet? And what it's really saying there is it's making a statement that water is wet, and it's asking if that statement is true. That's what the word is does, right? When you have it in the middle of the sentence, it's saying something is true. When you have it at the front, it's asking a question whether that thing is true or not. With that word out of the way, the next word in question would be water. What is that? I certainly don't know what that is. So I did some Googling. I did about 4 hours of Googling. I finally came down to a conclusion. Water is a chemical, very scary thing. It's made of hydrogen and oxygen. I'm terrified of those two when they're together. I think most people should be, because when you have hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, you get a little bit of energy near there and you fucking nuke the place, right? So I don't know why we're even questioning this water stuff, because it seems kind of dangerous, because they're already together. I don't know what's going to happen with that. It seems unstable. But that's besides the point. Is it wet? To determine whether or not water is wet, you need to find out what wet means. And I've only ever heard this in sexual contexts, so I wasn't sure if we were talking about whether water was wet as in it was horny or not. So I did some more research, and apparently it also means something that has been, well, not something that has been. It is a descriptive word, an adjective used to describe something that is covered in water. And that's when the light bulb goes off in my head. That's when I see the flaw here. Because for water to be wet, that would mean it is covered in water. And I've only done like 4 years of school in recent memory, and by recent memory I mean before the incident, but in those 4 years of school, I learned one thing. I learned that you should be putting a comma before the word and. Outside of school, though, I learned something a little more useful, that the world is made up of molecules, right? And that includes water, I presume, because I have heard people say the word water molecule. So if water is also made of molecules, and for something to be wet means that it has water on it, then surely that would mean for water to be wet, it would have to have water molecules on it. And I'm not going to play dumb here. Water can mean an individual water molecule, but I'm also aware that it can mean multiple combined. It can be used to refer to the plural as well. So let's take a look at both usages of the word. If you are talking about a single water molecule, water in the singular, then obviously it's not wet. It can't be wet in the singular. It's one molecule. It cannot possibly have more molecules on it. Then it would not be one molecule. Then it would be talking about water in the plural, which is a thing people do. People do that sometimes. Freaks, if you ask me. Now, if we're talking about water in the plural, I still think the argument that it's wet's a little shaky. Because if you know anything about three-dimensional space, you know that shapes have an inside and an outside, right? And I will grant the wet water camp that on the inside, those water molecules, they are wet. Because they are surrounded, they are covered by other water molecules. They're covered in water, they're wet. But it falls apart with the external water molecules. Because those aren't covered in water, they're covering water. And they can't be wet for that reason. Water molecules on the outside of a drop, or on the outside of a lake or a pool or river, whatever vessel of water you're talking about, they're not covered in water. They're covering water, so they can't be wet. And so, depending on which interpretation of the word water you're using, if you're using the singular interpretation, there's no way that is wet. It can't be wet. It's one water. You need at least 2 waters for it to be wet, and only one can be wet at a time in that situation. But if you are talking about water in the plural, then yes, some water is wet, but not all of it, because the internal water, that's wet, that's covered in water. The external water is not covered in water. But, and here's the nail in the coffin for the wet water camp. If you say, is water wet? And you respond, yes, that would mean all water is wet. And that is just not true. Because external water, as I have said probably 5 times now, I'm not keeping count, that water is not wet. That water is dry. Well, it may not be dry, but it's not wet. I don't know what it is. I have no idea what it is. So, is water wet? Kind of.
Anyway, like, I don't know, sleep well, I love you. Mwah.